Every day, your mind is making decisions long before you notice them. Small decisions, constant decisions, silent decisions, what to respond to, what to ignore, what deserves attention, what feels urgent, what can wait. Most people think decision-making only applies to major life choices, career decisions, financial decisions, relationship decisions. But the reality is, your mental energy is being consumed continuously throughout the day, and eventually, that mental energy starts running low. That's when something subtle begins happening. Your decisions change, not dramatically at first, but gradually, quietly, consistently. You become more reactive, more impulsive, more emotionally driven, not because your intelligence changed, but because your mental resources became depleted. This is what's known as decision fatigue, and most people experience it every single day without realizing it. Because decision fatigue doesn't always feel obvious. Sometimes it feels like procrastination, sometimes it feels like irritability, sometimes it feels like indecision, sometimes it feels like opening your phone, even though you opened it 30 seconds ago. And what makes this more complicated is that modern environments dramatically increase the number of decisions your brain has to process. Every notification creates a decision. Every message creates a decision. Every piece of information asks your brain to evaluate something. Should I respond? Should I ignore this? Should I check this now? Is this important? Even small interactions consume mental energy, and individually, they seem insignificant. But collectively, they overload attention. This matters because attention and decision-making are deeply connected. Good decisions require cognitive clarity. They require space, perspective, stable thinking. But when the brain becomes overloaded, it starts looking for shortcuts. That's what fatigued minds do. They simplify, react, avoid complexity. And this begins affecting behavior in very predictable ways. For example, people become more impulsive when mentally fatigued. Why? Because impulsive decisions require less cognitive effort. Thinking deeply takes energy. Evaluating long-term consequences takes energy. Holding multiple perspectives in your mind takes energy. Reacting emotionally is easier. That's why people often make decisions they later regret when mentally exhausted. Not because they suddenly became irrational, but because cognitive fatigue reduced the quality of attention behind the decision. This also explains why discipline feels inconsistent. People often believe discipline is purely a personality trait, but discipline is heavily affected by mental state. The more mentally overloaded you become, the harder it becomes to resist easy rewards. Because the brain naturally seeks relief when fatigued, and modern environments provide endless forms of instant relief. Scrolling, entertainment, distraction, impulse purchases, comfort behaviors. Not necessarily because people lack self-control, but because mentally depleted brains prioritize short-term ease. That's important to understand, because it changes how you interpret behavior. A lot of people blame themselves for lacking consistency, when the real issue is cognitive exhaustion. And cognitive exhaustion accumulates quietly. Most people don't notice how mentally overloaded they are until clarity disappears. Simple decisions begin feeling difficult. Small tasks feel heavier. Concentration decreases. And eventually, avoidance begins appearing. Not laziness, avoidance. Because overwhelmed minds start delaying decisions that feel cognitively demanding. That's why people postpone emails, delay conversations, avoid planning. Not because they don't care, but because their attention has become overloaded. And overloaded attention struggles with complexity. This becomes even more serious in leadership and high responsibility environments, because leaders are rarely judged only by effort. They're judged by decisions. And the quality of those decisions depends heavily on mental clarity. But many people are trying to make important decisions inside environments that continuously destroy clarity. Constant interruptions, Continuous communication, fragmented attention, no recovery, no stillness, no uninterrupted thought. That environment slowly degrades decision quality. Not immediately, but over time. This is why so many people feel mentally exhausted despite not doing deeply meaningful work. Their attention is constantly active. The brain rarely gets a break from evaluation, and evaluation consumes energy. Even passive scrolling creates cognitive load. Your brain is continuously filtering information, comparing, judging, processing. That ongoing processing creates fatigue, and fatigue changes behavior. One of the clearest signs is reduced long-term thinking. Fatigued minds become more present-focused. Immediate comfort becomes more appealing than future benefit. That's why people often abandon routines, not because the routines stop mattering, but because mental fatigue reduced their ability to sustain intentional behavior. This also affects emotional regulation. The more mentally overloaded people become, the more emotionally reactive they often become. Patience decreases, tolerance decreases, and frustration increases, and again, not because personality changed, but because mental bandwidth decreased. That distinction matters enormously, because once people understand this, they stop treating every behavioral struggle as a character flaw and start recognizing the role mental overload plays in behavior. That awareness changes the approach completely. Instead of constantly trying to force better decisions, you begin protecting the conditions required for better thinking. That's the shift. Protecting clarity instead of constantly consuming it. And clarity requires recovery, mental stillness, reduced stimulation, fewer unnecessary decisions. This is why highly effective people often simplify parts of their lives, not because simplicity is trendy, but because unnecessary complexity drains attention. And attention is limited. Every unnecessary decision consumes cognitive energy that could be used somewhere more meaningful. That's why structure matters. Routines matter, environment matters, recovery matters. Not because they magically create success, but because they preserve attention. And preserved attention improves judgment. This doesn't mean eliminating all stress or all decisions. That's impossible. It means recognizing that your mental energy is not infinite. And if you continuously overload it, decision quality eventually declines. That decline may appear subtle at first. More impulsiveness, less patience, reduced clarity, poor judgment. But over time, small decisions compound into larger outcomes. That's why protecting mental clarity matters so much. Because your life is shaped by repeated decisions, and repeated decisions are shaped by the condition of your attention. So if you constantly feel mentally drained, indecisive, reactive, or cognitively overloaded, don't just ask, how do I become more disciplined? Ask, what is continuously draining my attention? That question changes the focus completely, because better decisions don't start with forcing yourself harder. They start with creating conditions where clear thinking becomes possible again. And once clarity returns, better decisions often follow naturally, because the quality of your decisions will rarely exceed the quality of the attention behind them.